Good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon the functional skills session. Today we're looking at fractions, working towards a level 2 standard. So the first thing you guys need to know about fractions is obviously the relationships between fractions, decimals and percentages. So as you'll see from this image, if you start with 1/5, so 1/5 as a fraction, if you then divide, so you do 1 divided by 5, gives you 0.2, so it's then converted into a decimal. If you then times 0.2 by 100, because it's 100%, that will give you 20. So 20% is the same as 0.2 in a decimal, is the same as 1/5. And then if you divide that 20%, if you divide 100 by 5, then that gives you 20. So that's where you then, that takes you back. 20 is 1/5 of 100. So the loop then starts again. So with fractions, you need to make sure that one or more of the equal parts of a whole number, so a number usually expressed in the form a over b, so either a 1/4, 2 5/8, or 7/4. So with a decimal, it's any number shown with a decimal point, so a number based upon tenths or hundredths. So an example could be 0.2, 0.375, 86.4, etc. You've then got percentages. So the word percent comes from the Latin and means for each 100 or per 100. So that's where percentages come from. So that could relate to 70%, 6.5%, 4.09%. Okay, so I'm going to show you a video on fractions.
Okay, so far we've learned how fractions represent parts of things, and we've learned how to do some simple math with those parts. But if we want to really understand how fractions work, we need to start thinking about them in a new way. We need to learn what fractions really are. A fraction is just a number that's written like a division problem. You remember division, right? Where you take one number and divide it up by another number? And you might also remember that there's different ways to write a division problem. When you first learn about division, you usually see division problems written like this. Now that symbol in the middle just means divide this number by that number. Then you learn it's useful to write a division problem a different way, like this. Now that's still the same division problem. It just uses a different symbol to tell us to divide. So that's 2 different ways to write the same division problem. But wait, there's more. Now some of you who use computers a lot might have seen division written like this. Now that slash is just another way to write the division symbol. Now this one's interesting. Watch what happens when we rearrange it a little bit. Look familiar? Yep, it's a division problem that looks like a fraction. And that's just because a fraction really is a division problem, but we treat it like a number. The line between the top and bottom numbers is just another way of writing the division symbol. The top number is the number being divided up, and we call it the numerator. The bottom number is the number we're dividing by, and we call it the denominator. Now let's look at some of the common fractions that you're already familiar with and think of them as division problems. For example, 1/2 or 1/2 is really just 1 divided by 2. The fraction 2/3 or 2/3 really means 2 divided by 3. And the fraction 3/4 or 3/4 really means 3 divided by 4. Thinking about fractions like little division problems might seem strange to some of you, especially because these division problems show smaller numbers being divided by larger numbers. You may not have seen that before. You might not have even thought it was possible, but you can divide a smaller number by a bigger one. It just means that the answer you get is going to be smaller than 1. If the idea of dividing a smaller number by a bigger one seems confusing to you, don't worry. It's going to make a lot more sense in the next section when we learn about decimal numbers and how they relate to fractions. Let's review what we've learned so far. This section was short, but in it, we learned the most important thing there is to know about fractions. We learned that fractions are numbers that are written like division problems. The line between the top and bottom numbers is another form of the division symbol. That tells you to divide the top number by the bottom number. The top number is called the numerator, and the bottom number is called the denominator. It might be a new idea to you, but you can divide a smaller number by a bigger number. This was a really important concept we covered, so be sure to do the exercises before you move on.
Okay, so hopefully you've now got a basic understanding of what fractions are, and that video just helped you to recap on the basics of fractions and how you can kind of link them and separate them, and how they are just a simple division problem. Okay, so fractions. So a fraction is part of a whole number. So as you've just learned on the video, the top number is called the numerator, the bottom number is called the denominator. Handy words to just remember, because it might be a word that they use in the exam, and if you can't remember which one's which, then it could confuse you. So try to get used to using the numerator and the denominator. So the fraction 3/5 means 3 parts out of 5. An equivalent fraction is a fraction that can be written in different ways but have the same value. So what I mean by that is 1 whole can be written as 2 halves. Still means there's a whole, but you can have 2 halves. And the same, you can see the resemblance. So the actual diagram of the whole is exactly the same. It's just split up into different sections as you obviously look at different parts of the fraction. So then the bottom one, you're still just splitting that whole number up. So 2 quarters are the same as a half, and then 4 quarters are the same as a whole. So it's a really good way for you guys, especially in your exams, use your scrap paper, use that to your advantage, and if you're struggling, draw the fraction. So draw it as where you can then see it and visually separate it up. A lot of people like to use pizzas, so that's always a good one to use and divide up as well. But make the most of your scrap paper and write them down visually so you can see. So next video is just looking a little bit more in depth into fractions and how they are part of each other.
If you've been learning math for a while, then you probably already know a thing or two about fractions. And if you've ever had to, well, break a cookie in half to share with a friend, well, then you've used fractions in real life. Oh, well, thank you. That's because fractions are used to represent smaller pieces or parts of things. When you're first learning about fractions, it can help to draw pictures to see how they work. So let's start by drawing a circle. Now this circle represents what we call a hole. Now, not the kind of hole you can fall into, more like a whole cookie or a whole pizza. Now, if we divide that circle or whole amount into 4 parts, then we call each of those parts a fraction of the original whole circle. Because this is math and not art, we can't just keep on drawing pictures. We need to learn how to write out fractions using the language of math. Yep, you guessed it. That means using numbers. Unlike a regular number, to write a fraction, you need 2 numbers, 1 number on top, 1 number on bottom, and a line between them. I'll explain exactly what the line's for later in the video. But for now, let's figure out what those 2 numbers mean. Remember, fractions are used to represent parts of something. And the number on the bottom tells us how many parts that something is divided into. The number on top tells us how many of those parts we have. For example, let's write a fraction for our drawing here. I divided the circle into 4 parts, right? So the number on the bottom will be 4. And I still have all 4 of those parts, so the number on top will also be 4. I have 4 out of 4 parts. That means I still have a whole circle. But what if somebody came by and took away 1 part from the circle? Well, the circle's still divided into 4 parts, so the bottom number would still be 4. But I only have 3 of those parts left. So that means the top number will change to 3. So I have 3 over 4, or 3/4 of a circle. Make sense so far? Good. Let's try another example. Let's say that I divide a rectangle up into 8 parts. and I give you 3 of those parts. Since the total number of parts is 8, the bottom number will be 8. And since you have 3 of those parts, the top number will be 3. So the fraction I'm giving you is 3 over 8, or 3/8 of the rectangle. No need to think. Oh, and it's important to remember that for fractions to work right, the parts that you divide the whole up into have to be equal. We can't take a candy bar and say, well, I'm going to divide it into 2 parts. So this is your half and here's my half. Let's look at a few more examples so you can really see the pattern of how fractions can represent parts of objects. This rectangle is divided up into 3 equal parts, and 2 of them are shaded red. So 2 over 3, or 2/3 of the rectangle, is shaded red. The circle is divided into 12 equal parts, and 7 of those parts are shaded green. So 7 over 12, or 7/12 of the circle, is shaded green. The hexagon is divided into 6 equal parts, and 5 of those parts are shaded blue. So 5 over 6, or 5/6 of the hexagon, is shaded blue. All right, so you can see how fractions can be used to represent parts of objects like circles and rectangles, but fractions can be used for more than that. They can be used to represent parts of, well, anything, like pets, for example. Let's say you have 7 pets, 4 dogs, 2 cats, and a big fat hamster. Well, that means that 4 over 7, or 4/7 of your pets are dogs, and 2 over 7, or 2/7 of your pets are cats, and 1 over 7, or 1/7 of your pets are hamsters. It also means that your house probably smells like a pet store. Okay, so fractions can be used to represent anything from parts of a circle to kitty cats. But did you know that fractions can also be used to represent things you can't even see? Well, like a test score, for example. Let's say you take a math test and there's 20 questions on the test, and you get 17 of those questions right. That means that you got 17 over 20, or 17/20 of the questions right. All right, so that's the basic idea of how fractions can be used to represent parts of things. But there's a lot more to fractions than that. In the next section, we're going to be looking at some of the other things we can do with fractions. But before that, let's review. Fractions are used to represent parts of a whole. Fractions are written in the form of a top number over a bottom number with a line between them. The bottom number represents how many parts the whole is divided into, and the top number represents how many of those parts you have. And finally, the parts that a whole is divided up into must be equal for fractions to work right. To really understand how fractions are used to represent parts of things, be sure to do the exercises. And I'll see you in section 2. Learn more.
Okay. And again, hopefully you've now got even more of an understanding of fractions and how they work, and how the different parts are really important as to how many you have and how many are left. So now we're going to look at equivalent fractions. So you can produce equivalent fractions by multiplying and dividing both the top and the bottom by the same number. So basically, whatever you do to the top, you must do to the bottom. Okay, so as you'll see in the example, so 3/6, if you divided that by 3, you're gonna, it's basically, there's 3 halves in that 3/6. So 1 times 3 gives you 3, and 2 times 3 gives you 6. So you can see the relationship between the half and the 3/6, and how that you can have equivalent fractions. They both mean exactly the same, but the half is the easiest term to explain that answer. The separate diagram then shows 10/16 is exactly the same and equal to 5/8. And if you do 10 divided by 2, you're going to get 5. If you do 16 divided by 2, you're going to get 8. Okay, so they're again equivalent fractions, but it just shows you how you can go between them. Whatever you do to that top number, you must do exactly the same to the bottom number to go between simplifying them or making them bigger. So to simplify the fraction, you divide the top and the bottom number by the common factor. So that's the number that divides exactly into both the top and bottom number. So a fraction in its simplest form is when the top and bottom number cannot both be further divided by any other number other than 1. Okay, so next fractions video.
In a previous video, we learned all about factoring whole numbers. And now we're going to learn how factoring can help us when working with fractions. We're going to learn how to simplify fractions. Simplifying a fraction means rewriting the fraction using the smallest top and bottom numbers we can without changing the value of the fraction. To help us understand what simplifying a fraction really means, let's take a look at the simplest fraction I can think of, 1/2. Now, this is already as simple as it can possibly be, so let's go the other way and complicate it by dividing our rectangle here up into more parts. The amount of our rectangle that's shaded is still the same, but now the numbers for our fraction are 3/6. The numbers are bigger because our rectangle is now divided into more parts. The fraction we have now, 3/6, is equivalent to our original fraction, 1/2. That means they have the same value. They represent the same amount. So what if someone gives you the fraction 3/6, like 3/6 of a candy bar? Well, we know from our picture that that means they're really giving you 1/2. But how can we show that using math and not pictures? Well, that's where factoring comes in. Let's take our complicated fraction, 3/6, and factor both the top and bottom numbers. Now, the bottom number 6 can be factored into 2 times 3. The top number, 3, is a prime number. Its only factors are 1 and itself. So we can write that as 1 times 3. There, we've rewritten our fraction using factoring, and now it kind of looks like 2 fractions being multiplied together. 1/2 times 3/3. Of course, 3/3 is what I like to call a whole fraction, since its value is equal to 1. Now here's the interesting part. Since 3/3 equals 1, and multiplying by 1 has no effect on a number, we can just get rid of that 3/3. Basically, the 3 on the top and the 3 on the bottom cancel each other out. And once they're gone, we're left with the fraction 1/2. So that means that the fraction 3/6 simplifies to 1/2. Another way of thinking about it is that we're trying to find any whole fractions that are hiding in the fraction we're trying to simplify. And if we find any, we can just get rid of them, and the fraction we're left with is simpler than the one we started with. Now that we know the basics, let's learn the procedure for simplifying fractions. First, replace the top and bottom numbers of the fraction with their prime factors. Next, look to see if any of the factors are the same on the top and bottom. If they are, then we call them common factors because they're something that both the top and bottom have in common. If you find a pair of common factors, you can cancel them out. Just draw a line through them like this. And last, once all the common factors have been canceled, you need to remultiply any factors that are left over on the top or bottom. This makes sure that you end up with only one number on the top and bottom of your simplified fraction. Oh, and there's one important thing to remember. If you're ever able to cancel out all of the factors on the top or bottom of a fraction, don't be tempted to write in a 0. Put a 1 in there instead. The reason you can write in a 1 is because 1 is always a factor of any number. It's just we usually don't write it in. For instance, if you're going to factor the number 15, you just say that it's 5 times 3. But you could also say that it's 5 times 3 times 1. In fact, you could even say it's 5 times 3 times 1. See why there's always a 1 left over when you're canceling common factors? All right, so that's the basic idea behind simplifying fractions. And once you know the procedure, it's really not that hard. But you might want to rewatch this video just to make sure you've got the idea. Now, there aren't any exercises for this video because it's really just an introduction. But in part 2, we'll see a couple more examples of how you can use the procedure to simplify fractions, and then you'll get plenty of exercises to do as homework. There you go.
Okay, so hopefully you're now an expert in simplifying fractions, and that's made it a little bit more easier for you and a little bit more understanding. So now we're going to look at finding a fraction of an amount. So to find a fraction of a quantity, you divide the quantity by the denominator, so that's the bottom number, and then multiply it by the top number. So this is obviously a really effective process to use if you're looking at a fraction of an amount in terms of money. So if you're looking at how much something costs and you need to work out that you get a quarter off the price, or you're getting 1/3 off the price as a special offer today, this is how you're going to work it out. So if you've got 3/4 of 360, to find the 3/4 of that 360, you need to divide by 4, because that's the bottom number, as you've just learnt, and then multiply it by 3. So you start with your 360, you divide it by 4, which gives you 90. You've then got your £90, you times it by 3, gives you 270. So 3/4 of 360 is 270. So in your actual exam, when you're using your working out box, you don't have to show, as you're showing the working out as on the diagram, the pound signs in the working out part. However, if that is helpful for you and that makes you understand it better, then you can add them in. You won't lose marks for that, but you don't have to show the pound signs in the working out part. As long as you show the pound signs in the final answer, then you'll still pick up all of the marks. Okay, so have a go at this one yourself. So write down 1/5 and try and work out what 1/5 of 120 is. So pause the video, have a go, and then we'll see if you get it right. So to find 1/5, you divide by 5. So you start with your 120, you divide it by 5, that's going to give you 24. So when the numerator is 1, there's no need to multiply. So I don't then need to do that second step, times them by the top number, because the top number is 1. If I times it by 1, I'm going to still stay with 24. If you want to show that on your working out again, if that makes it more sense in your head, you can. Again, you won't lose any marks for that, but you don't have to show it because the answer will just stay at 24. Okay, so 1/5 of 120 is 24. So to evaluate one number as a fraction of another, to write one number as a fraction of another, you must first decide which quantity represents the whole amount. So this is then going to be your bottom number. The top is then the quantity which represents part of that amount. So it just goes back to earlier where it was how many parts were in that amount that we're trying to work out. So if you needed to write 5 as a fraction of 24, 24 is the whole number. That's how many you have. So this is the bottom part. 5 is the part of how many parts you have. So that's going to be the top number. So it would be written as 5 out of 24. So 5 over 24. But again, this is a really good example of you to take note of. So how it's written on the screen. So 5-24. That's how you're going to write it in your exam, because it's going to be an online assessment. You're not going to be able to show it as a proper fraction as you would normally see it. That's another way of showing it as a fraction. So that's just a little tip for you. So both quantities must be in the same units. So make sure you remember that. On this occasion, there wasn't any units given, so you just work in the logical order. And you should always give the fraction in this simplest form. So what you learned earlier, make sure that 5 over 24 is in the simplest form. Okay, so we're now going to look at adding and subtracting fractions. If the bottom numbers are the same, you just add or subtract the top two numbers. Nice and easy. So if we've got 3 6 and we want to add it to 1 6, top numbers get added together. So 3 plus 1 is 4. The bottom numbers remain the same, so you just carry that 6 over. So you can clearly see you've got 3 6 and 1 6. You've got 4 6 in total. Nice and easy when it comes to minus. So you've got 3 8, so you want to minus away 2 8s. It's going to leave you with 1 8. So your 3 minus your 2 gives you 1. Again, you just carry that 8 over. So you've got 1 8 as the answer. So that's the easy part. However, it's not so simple if the bottom numbers are different. You obviously then must even them up first before you can then add or take away. So this is done by finding a common bottom number. So this is what you're now going to learn.
Hi, and welcome to Math Antics. In the last video, we learned how easy it is to add and subtract fractions that have the same bottom number. We call those like fractions. But often you'll be asked to add or subtract fractions that have different bottom numbers, or unlike fractions. And we learned that the only way we can do that is to change our fractions so that they do have the same bottom number. All right then, how do we do that? How can we change two unlike fractions into two like fractions? How do we get our fractions to have a common denominator? The answer is we need to use equivalent fractions. You remember what equivalent fractions are, right? They're fractions that have the same value but use different top and bottom numbers, like 1/2 and 2/4. They both represent 1/2 but with different numbers. Well, whenever we have two unlike fractions that we need to add, if we could find equivalent fractions to use instead, and if those new equivalent fractions had the same bottom numbers as each other, then we'd be all set. We'd have two like fractions and we could add them using our procedure. Okay, but how do we find equivalent fractions that have a common denominator or the same bottom number? Well, there's two main ways of doing it. In this video, we're only going to learn the first way of doing it, and I like to call this way finding the easiest common denominator. In the next video, we'll talk about another method that some of you may have already heard about. It's called finding the least common denominator. Okay, so how does this easiest common denominator method work? Well, even though this is an easy method, it might sound a little complicated at first. But don't worry, it'll make a lot more sense once you've seen a few examples. In this method, the common denominator is always going to be the product of the bottom numbers. In other words, it will be the number you'd get if you multiplied the bottom numbers together. Basically, all we're going to do is take the two different bottom numbers and make two different whole fractions using them. Then we're going to move the whole fractions to the opposite sides and multiply them by our unlike fractions. Doing this will give us two new equivalent fractions that will have the same bottom number. Then we can add or subtract them easily. Okay, let's try a couple examples so we can see this method in action. Let's add the fractions 2/5 and 1/3. These are not like fractions because they have different bottom numbers, so we're going to change them. And the common denominator we will use is the product of the bottom numbers. 5 times 3 equals 15. We change them by multiplying each fraction by a whole fraction. The first whole fraction is going to be 3/3 because 3 is the second fraction's denominator. And the second whole fraction is going to be 5/5 because 5 is the first fraction's denominator. Next, we multiply starting with our first fraction. On the top, 3 times 2 equals 6. And on the bottom, 3 times 5 equals 15. So our first fraction has become 6/15. Now for the second fraction. On the top, 1 times 5 equals 5. And on the bottom, 3 times 5 equals 15. So our second fraction has become 5/15. Now we just add them using our procedure for adding like fractions. We add the top numbers, 6 plus 5 equals 11, and then we keep the same bottom number, which is 15. So that means the answer to 2/5 plus 1/3 is 11/15. That's pretty easy, huh? All right, let's see one more example of this method. Let's add the fractions 7/8 and 3/10. Our common denominator for this problem is going to be 80, because that's what we get when we multiply the denominators together. 8 times 10 equals 80. We'll multiply our 7/8 by the whole fraction 10/10. And we'll multiply our 3/10 by the whole fraction 8/8. Then, when we do our multiplication, the 8 times 10 will give us 80 on the bottom of both fractions. For the top of the first fraction, we have 7 times 10 equals 70. And the top of the second fraction, we have 3 times 8 equals 24. Now that we have like fractions, we can just add the top numbers. 70 plus 24 equals 94. And keep the bottom number the same, 80. So 7/8 plus 3/10 equals 94/80. Some of you see that this answer could be simplified. Be sure to check out our videos on mixed numbers and simplifying fractions to see how you could do that for your final answer. All right, That's the first way you can find the common denominator and change your unlike fractions into like fractions so you can add or subtract them easily. Remember, practice is really important in math, so be sure to do the exercises for this section so you really get the hang of it. After that, check out the next video and I'll show you how to use a different method to find what we call the least common denominator.
Okay, so that is the basics of what you need to know about fractions and what could come up in your exams. Looking at the fractions, understanding them, the relationship between fractions, decimals, and percentages. So some of the exam questions will ask you to, they may give you an answer and say, can you put that in a fraction or a decimal or a percentage? They may get you to work out part of a question. You may get the answer as a decimal. They may then say, no, can you show that as a fraction? So there's various different ways that they can do that. There could be a question in there which gives you a fraction in the answer, and then you then need to show that in the simplest form. So you'll need to do that. There could then be another question of you having to actually add, subtract the fractions. So it's really good idea for you to practice. Obviously, fractions is one of the most difficult part of maths and probably the most difficult part of functional skills level 2. So it's one of those ones that you're going to have to keep practicing. So there is a Kahoot app, a Kahoot quiz that you can do, and I can send you the link for. So just email me if you wish that link and you can have a go at that. There's just 5 questions on there to see what you've learned from the presentation that's been delivered today. But as I've just said, practice always makes perfect. So there is a worksheet that also comes with this presentation. So again, you can email me and ask for the worksheet, and it just puts into, there's probably like 3 or 4 questions on each of simplifying fractions, making them equivalent fractions, finding that common denominator. So it's just practice for you and showing that all you're working out and getting into the habit of showing that for your final exam. So if you do want to have a go at the Kahoot quiz, or you want to have a go at the worksheet, then email me, canderson@premier.com, and I'll send them straight over for you. Once they're done, you can then, whether you show that they are on a Word document, so you can either show you're working out on the Word document, or you can print them out and do it by hand, or you can write your answers in an email, as long as you clearly state which question you're answering. It's entirely up to you, whatever works for you, whatever method you prefer. I'm more than happy to then mark them for you, or send you the answer sheet so you can mark them yourself. Okay, thanks for listening to the presentation. I hope you found this helpful. And like I said, just get in contact should you need any extra support. I'm more than willing to help out. Thank you very much.